don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the Thought Stretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about important issues in education through rich inquiry. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these conversations for complexity and nuance. Hello, everyone, and thanks for tuning in. If you are a regular listener to this podcast, you will probably realize that I have not published a podcast in about 6 weeks, and quite honestly, it's been a nice break as we've been busy over here, and after years of podcasting basically every week, it's been kind of nice to take some time off and recharge and think about some more conversations that I'd like to have going forward. We had a really great PBL Grow 25 event here in Louisville, so thanks to those who attended that. And we've been busy and will be busy working in schools around the world on all kinds of things, including project-based learning and inquiry and differentiated instruction, and some professional learning options that we file under civics education. It's become increasingly clear to me that we have now for generations done a poor job of building understanding of the Enlightenment principles that undergird our democracy. While I applaud the work of organizations that I've talked about here on this podcast and in other places that focus on more civil conversation and things like that, it seems clear to me that a missing piece of the puzzle is an understanding of Enlightenment intellectual and civic principles. These things include free speech and free expression and a process by which we figure out what is reality and what is not. And as we grow further and further from what might be called a reality-based community, it seems imperative that we return a focus on learning and understanding and then applying those kinds of principles. These kinds of principles are not necessarily intuitive, but something that needs to be retaught to every generation, and I think we've done a poor job of that. So if you're interested in that kind of work with your school, which again I think is fundamentally an inquiry project, but filed under the civics education broader topic, please do reach out to me. I'd love to have a conversation with you about that. This conversation here is a bit of a departure from our normal episodes, as it was recorded with me being the guest on another podcast. As you'll hear, this conversation is with Shane Leaning, who is an organizational coach, author, and podcaster in his own right. He lives in Shanghai, China, and he asked me to come on and talk about nuanced and complex conversations. And I enjoyed this conversation enough that I thought it might be worth sharing with my audience. I'll put links to Shane's work in the show notes and to his version of the podcast, which has some other commentary around it if you'd like to listen to that. But we will be having another conversation that should be published as a podcast here to discuss his book, which is called Change Starts Here: What If Everything Your School Needed Was Right in Front of You? You can see his work at shaneleaning.com. And as I said, I really enjoyed this conversation and hope you find it helpful. If you're interested in our work, of course, you can reach out to us and me at wegrowteachers.com. There you'll find all of our work and workshops and professional services, including lots of project-based learning, inquiry-based learning, what we call knowledge-rich inquiry, differentiated instruction, and some of those topics that I think are really germane and important in the conversation that you're about to listen to here. And of course, you can always email me straight away at drew@thoughtstretchers.org. And now here's my conversation with Shane. You'll hear some intro and outro music that was part of his podcast version. So hopefully that's not too distracting. And it's a pretty brief conversation. So again, I sure hope you enjoy this. Most of the school leaders that we're working with are really all that tuned into the sort of online kinds of discussions and debates that you and I are probably paying more attention to than maybe we perhaps should. Occasionally you'll get some. I do think they're probably getting some pressure from their community and, parents of their students and, maybe board members who might be online a bit here or there, but watching cable news or hearing those kinds of pressure points, usually here in the States at least, a lot of them are culture war kinds of things. And then those pressures, I think, are probably what school leaders are being subject to a little bit more than Twitter fights.
It's funny, isn't it? Because you and I have been on Twitter for a while. I'm not on there really much anymore, but on other platforms. But you can get lulled into a sense that the conversation online is the conversation that's playing out. And yet you've just alluded to, and I think that's my experience with the principals that I work with as well, is most are just totally unaware of these debates that are going on online.
Yeah, and probably that's much more healthy. The things that manifest from online back and forths, I think, is generally unhealthy. It tends to, I think, unfortunately, I don't know if radicalize is quite the right word, but in some ways, I think there's some element of that, right? There's people who are persuaded or convinced that they should entrench themselves into one side or the other, and that the fight is really important, as opposed to, how do I figure out what this person is saying? How do I understand what they're saying, what they're thinking? Maybe consider they might be right about something. What are they right about? What might they be right about? Online discourse, quote unquote discourse, doesn't exactly foster that particularly well.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. Although I also feel a little bit let down sometimes, if that's the way to put it. Because I feel like as educators, shouldn't we be more immune to that kind of thing? But yeah, it seems that the binary arguments do come up quite a lot.
But why would we as educators be more immune to it? Because we're ostensibly more into thinking and learning?
Because we do that for our students? Is because we encourage that for the children we serve? Maybe?
Maybe. Well, I think we should. I think teachers should be, as we talk about our work, we do work in lots of inquiry-based work and project-based learning, but we also are trying to work with schools on helping them establish or reinforce a reality-based community using what we call objective pluralism, Enlightenment liberal principles, the sort of things that do get us to that space where we're considering other opinions and perspectives and seeing that those are valuable, even if we may disagree with them. But there's a lot of K-12 school that's not particularly relevant, or at least it shouldn't be, right? There's not much of that should be happening in the teaching of multiplication facts, right? Although some folks online can find ways to do that. So I do think that there are, I was a social studies teacher, history and government and psychology, and those kinds of things, humanities courses, those I think are ripe with topics and concepts that are rich for really having some debate about, really maybe arguing about that perspective or the ways to think about it. But then there are other things that are, I think, less so. And certainly we shouldn't be debating whether 2 + 2 is 4 in our schools.
So you mentioned there about your work, and your work, a lot of the time, a lot of discussion I see about inquiry, for example. And yet I know recently, for example, on your brilliant podcast, which I'm a real fan of, and you hosted a bit of a panel discussion. I think you're trying to do a few more panels, aren't you, at the minute, which is great. And you purposely had some quite big thinkers and kind of direct instruction approach there. But that's a perfect example of a divide that seems to have two sides that have set out their stalls. Where did you kind of get involved in that kind of debate? And have you grown through it?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I don't know if there's anything to point to specifically, but that's just been my disposition, I think, from growing up in a family that sort of valued that kind of thing. I do remember friends coming over to dinner and remarking that, boy, you talk about all kinds of things at dinner, which apparently was pretty unique. And as I've grown professionally and worked more professionally, I've come to value it more.
partly because I think it's important for figuring out what's true and what's accurate and what's right, especially if we're thinking about teaching and best approaches, to sort of be dispassionate about what you are thinking is right and trying to be wrong for as short a time as possible. But there's also, I think it seems more important every day here in the States, at least, and I think probably around the world, in terms of the polarization and the poor conversation that people are having, really sort of feeling like they should be arguing about things, that things are so existential. So I really want to, and find it valuable to figure out what the quote unquote other side is thinking. And again, where they might be right, where they might be wrong, and where I might be wrong. So we want to understand and be understood more than we want to or should want to be right. And I think that's a much more healthy place. The sort of ongoing forever debate between traditional instruction or direct instruction or whatever that might be, and inquiry and progressive education, it's not an either or, it's a yes and. And I really love being able to talk with people who may agree with that or disagree with that. And I encounter both. I've recently talked with several folks who yeah, I see that. And we might disagree about the exact specifics of where and when certain approaches might need to be better employed, that kind of thing. But most folks, I think, are more inclined to, especially in a real conversation, not an online back and forth, to say, oh, I see what you're saying. Yes. Or, ask some questions about that. I just don't think it's helpful at all to make that thinking more dichotomous. So, and you asked, have I grown through that? I certainly, as somebody who works with educators and works on professional learning, we do, again, a lot of inquiry-based, a lot of project-based learning work. And one of the things that I certainly have thought more about, and when I talk with school leaders who are interested in working with us, I try to make sure that they understand that we want to make sure that we're not falling into that trap of what I think progressive educators can fall into, which is, oh, knowledge isn't important, or teachers aren't really supposed to teach, and sort of eschewing that sort of direct instruction, explicit instruction, more traditional side, because somehow they think that that's not good for, or not a part of project-based learning. So we want to make sure that we're presenting and sharing with them the things that are important from cognitive science or science of learning or whatever you want to call it.
I like how you said there, when you're in a real conversation, someone might be able to say, oh, okay, I see what you're saying. And maybe actually in the online arena or over text chat, which is like the Twitter X world or wherever it is, that's very difficult to get context across. And so these big arguments can end up erupting, or it can make people more binary in their approach. It's got me thinking now, if you're online and you've got, a decent following online, then isn't there a responsibility as those people who are talking online to be careful of what they're saying? Because I'm thinking that school leaders who might tune in to these conversations to try and get ideas or advice might just find that just totally overwhelming or confusing, in that you've got all these strong messages, and where do you get the good quality information from? Or do you think it's just the online arena is just a debating place and that shouldn't be where people are going to try and find good information?
I think that if you approach the online space as an opportunity to learn and to listen to people and their best arguments and perhaps their worst arguments, I think that can be really powerful for school leaders. I don't think that would be the number one place, or perhaps certainly not the only place, right? But to find voices who are, I think, interested and communicating nuance and complexity of ideas. And when I hear somebody online, whether it's a conversation podcast or whether they're sending out messages, and they're speaking in absolutist sort of terms with a sort of smug certainty sometimes, that to me makes me wonder, about the quality of their ideas overall. Doesn't necessarily disqualify them, but does at least sort of discredit them, at least in some way. Which isn't to say that their ideas aren't good, but they're also, you say, well, what's the thinking of this person that is valuable? But what are the limits in what they might be sharing? Because when they talk about these ideas, they're very narrow in the scope. They're not recognizing or acknowledging that complexity and nuance. And so take that for what it's worth, right? You look at it and say, well, maybe they have some really good ideas about this part of the sort of spectrum, but they're overlooking all of these things. But at least maybe we can take some things from here. And I think that's definitely true of some of the science of learning folks. And I'm sure very true of some of the more progressive educators too.
You've got to almost have an open stance when you're engaging in these to think, there's value here. Where might they be coming from? Where might that value be that I want to take?
Yeah, I think sometimes people will wonder if they see me, for example, online and my behavior, they'll think I'm arguing with people. And I'm rarely doing that, or at least not trying to. Once in a while, it may go into that space. But generally, what I'm trying to do and what I find valuable about online discourse, back and forths, is that it's an opportunity for me to learn how people are thinking about any particular topic. And the way that they respond to things that I might say tells me more about what they're thinking. And just like in a classroom, what we want to know is, do students understand the things that we want them to understand? And that's more than just knowing something, right? Just reciting things. But how do students respond to questions or to prompts or to information? And that's, I think, the same, similar at least, dynamic in between people when I'm trying to interact online. One thing I try not to do is to persuade people online. That's not really what I'm after. I'm trying to understand what their position is and how they think about these things. And maybe if presented with something that seems like a contradiction in their thinking, how do they respond? Some will block you and shut you down and say, I don't want to have this conversation. You're being rude. But the others that will continue that conversation, I think you can learn a lot about how people think, even if you think this person is totally wrong. I'm in a back and forth with a friend of mine on Facebook about our current administration here in the States, Trump, and I'm not a fan. And I'm saying this is chaos. I think the evidence is pretty clear. And he's saying, let him cook is what he says. So you said, well, let's let him cook, but what's the evidence? And when we're going back and forth, I'm really trying to be careful, for example, to say, here's what I think. Not saying you're completely wrong and here's why you're wrong. And I'm really trying to win this argument, because I told him, I'm not here to persuade you. If you get persuaded, fine. If not, we can agree to disagree and move along.
I really like how you just said that, Drew. Like, when you're engaging in these conversations, if you want to do it right, it's almost you need to focus on I. Like, this is what I'm thinking, or this is not you. This is what I'm thinking about it. I think that's quite nice. I am curious, though, like you said, sometimes it can fall into argument for argument's sake. Or do you have any moments where you feel like you've crossed that line? Is it easy to identify when that line's been crossed?
Well, I've certainly, you mentioned podcasts that I've had, and one of the podcasts that I've recently released was including Paul Kirshner. And Paul and I have talked, and as he said in this recent podcast, that we've locked horns, quote unquote, on inquiry versus direct instruction. And that certainly has moved into that space on occasion. Although in some ways it's sort of in good fun a little bit. If anybody knows Paul, he's a bit prickly, maybe to put it mildly. But he would acknowledge that, I think. And moving into that space, politics and culture war kinds of things can do that pretty easily. If folks are familiar with Howard Gardner here in the States, and he's sort of a famously progressive educator who I spoke with recently on our podcast. And one of the things that he emphasizes, and I think is really important, is sort of the idea of disinterestedness. And we want to approach these things from a sort of disinterestedness kind of perspective. Not that we shouldn't be interested in things and be passionate about things, but the conversation should be more disinterested. And when we start to feel the emotions rise and feel like we're in attack mode, I think that's a sign that we're getting into argument space and getting away from the learning space, which is more disinterested and curious and saying, tell me more. What makes you say that? What's the evidence for that? Those kinds of things.
I love that word, to be disinterested. And I hear what you say. It's not like the opposite of passion, really. In fact, you can probably be passionately disinterested in disinterestedness, if you like, because it's a good thing to be passionate about nowadays, I would say, like in this binary world that we're in, and where everyone's got an interest, which means a side. To be disinterested sounds like something we should all be pretty passionate about.
Yeah, no doubt. I think it's really an opportunity for schools to, I guess, go back to, or I think we've lost touch with, one way to describe it is the Enlightenment liberal principles, which is, again, a reality-based community, relies on things like fallibilism and objectivity and exclusivity and disconfirmation, civility, professionalism, those kinds of things. And when you're coming to trying to figure out what's true and what's real, the way to do that, if we lean into the sort of science testing and figuring out what's true, the way to do that is to be disinterested and is to be dispassionate about it. Because when we're not, then the conclusions that we reach are generally overly subject to what we want to be true. And that's not a good place, whether it's in learning, whether it's in culture war issues, whether it's, school leaders trying to figure out what's right. What we want to be true may not be what's best. COVID and lockdowns, I think, is a good example. That was a hard thing for school leaders to navigate, partly because it was something that was important to be passionate about. But where do you get your information and how do you make the decisions based on evidence? And when you have such polarization, at least here in the States, we had such polarization where you stood on whether schools should be open or closed or kids should be wearing masks or not masks, basically was a signal to what tribe you're in. That's not a good recipe for good decision-making. And we saw some really poor decision-making, I think, because of that.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. And nowhere is this more important than in education as well. And I think it's understandable that people get particularly passionate about education because of its importance, right? But we've got to really take note of ourselves. So I'm interested in some of the work you're doing in this space, and in particular that you're creating spaces for more balanced conversations. That conversation with Paul Kirshner that you mentioned, I'll link in the show notes. I think it's a wonderful example of a space that's been created to have a balanced conversation. I wonder if you could talk me through a little bit about your ideas. What got you into doing that, and what are you thinking about in this kind of area?
Well, I've been doing the podcast for a number of years. I don't even know how many episodes we're at this point. And a lot of the conversations I think are great. And as you and I have talked, not on recording, one of the reasons I do it is because I really enjoy the conversations in almost all cases. And I'm very fortunate to be able to have those conversations and, have people reach out and say, can you make some time for John Hattie? I'm like, well, let's see if I can clear some calendar or Howard Gardner or something, right?
Yeah, let me think about it.
It amazes me that I get these requests because we're certainly not the biggest podcast and not necessarily trying to be the biggest podcast. But I do think it's really valuable for educators to hear other educators and some teachers and some non-teachers, but people in the space who are serious thinkers about education issues, to talk with one another and bounce ideas off of each other in a good faith space. And that's hard to find time to do that. It's hard to find space to do that. And it's also, it's a little bit of a challenge, as you well know, to get people to engage as a listener of long form conversations. I mean, honestly, I enjoy the conversations, and perhaps I'm just being very selfish in that I enjoy the conversations and hope others find it valuable. So yeah, as you mentioned, we've done a few. We've got some others coming up. One, we're going to talk about the science of dialogue and dichotomous thinking. If you're familiar with Andrew Watson, he and I were going back and forth about some project-based learning research. He'd just written a blog piece about one study that he thought, well, this is pretty credible. And he was, in this blog piece, in good faith, really trying to challenge his priors and maybe change his mind. So that's the kind of thinker and person I want to have more conversation with. So we're trying to set that up with some other voices that might bring other perspectives, right? One of the things of a reality-based community is that it respects and actually seeks out pluralism. And that, I think, is just really, really valuable if you're looking to get to the nuance and complexity, to come back to my favorite terms, of any particular issue. So I love those conversations. I hope others enjoy them. It, to me, is just really interesting to hear. Not interviews, those are fine, but a conversation like you and I are having here, where it might be more conversational, more organic than sort of scripted, and I'm going to ask these 10 questions and then we'll get out of here.
Yeah, that's a real turn-off for me when I tune into one of those kind of conversations. And I guess on that point, you've mentioned this twice, and I should have asked you the first time. Reality-based community, Drew. Tell me about that. I haven't heard that term used in that way before.
So in the States here, at least, there's such polarization. And one of the things that I think people have lost touch with, but actually inherently and implicitly understand and think is true, is that Enlightenment liberal principles that really are things that support democracy and support what Jonathan Rauch, if you're familiar with his work, I'm a really big fan of his work. Kindly Inquisitors, which is a book that he released in the early 90s, and then The Constitution of Knowledge, I think in 2020. Don't quote me on that. But really setting out the ways in which we understand what is true and what is not true. And I think that's obviously a real challenge in today's world because we have such segmented media, we have such partisan tribalism. So how do we get away from that? And I think schools have an opportunity and should be really teaching this and modeling this, and teachers should be modeling it. Those are the things that, some of those things that I mentioned, right? The fallibilism, objectivity, pluralism, disconfirmation, fallibilism, that no one person has the truth or can tell you this is the truth. And that's a problem. And so fundamentally, it's an inquiry project, right? So this is one of the arguments that I make for the use of inquiry in schools, not just for sort of deeper learning and to get to more conceptual playing with ideas and interconnectedness, but I mean, it's really instilling that mindset of how might I be wrong and how can I change my mind more quickly to not be wrong, and how can I understand what the other person is saying, even if I disagree with them, and make sure that they understand what I'm thinking. And to me, that is something that is fundamental to sort of getting us out of the sort of polarization death spiral that we're in.
What we need to do is spend enough time together that we can start to translate our ideas into each other's language and include one another in this community of inquiry. And that is the work of love.